If you're a Final Fantasy veteran, you already know that Final Fantasy XVI is the biggest deviation from the mainline formula yet, and if you're not a Final Fantasy veteran, most of them don't play like this one does. However, to both groups I'd also say, it's not really all that different. Sure, gameplay is much more action-oriented than ever before, it's straight up an action game, there's no party system, no skill tree, no real elemental aspects, but the story is still very much a Final Fantasy JRPG epic. Crystals and a hero that has to save the world, and a story that has twists and turns as you progress, incredible action pieces, grandiose boss fights with musical scores just as grand, and cutscenes. Oh my god, so many cutscenes. It's both very Final Fantasy and not, and that conflict is part of why this game holds itself back.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
Don't get me wrong, at a high level, Final Fantasy XVI is a good game, but when you start getting into some of the details, the flaws are pretty easy to find, and makes Final Fantasy XVI fall just short of true greatness. Let's talk about it. This is a review of Final Fantasy XVI. Hey, Danny with the DMGT here, your new favorite place for all things music, gaming, and tech. Okay, so to be honest, I'm a little less concerned with what makes a quote-unquote good Final Fantasy game because I'm just more interested in what makes a good gaming experience. I start with and give the most weight to actual gameplay and mechanics, but if a good story and its pacing is handled well, it can compensate, ultimately answering questions like, what does this game set out to accomplish? How well does it reach those goals? Because that usually informs you as a gamer if this is something you're interested in or not. Still, there is a certain expectation when you slap a Roman numeral to a Final Fantasy game, so I'll dig into that as I go. Let's start with the setting and landscapes. The world of Valisthea says no thank you to the modernist, machine, steampunk worlds of recent Final Fantasy mainline titles to return to the good old medieval Europe vibes with the high fantasy, magic, dragons, ancient machinery, and technology that still does kind of exist, and little to no people of color because there were only white people in medieval Europe. Wait, that's not right. Anyways, one of the coolest things to me about this world is how commodified magic was in the world. The blessing of the mother crystals meant that people were using these for everything from water to irrigation to fires for cooking and construction. It wasn't just some gameplay and cutscene thing to terrorize the civilian NPCs, which added some really cool depth to the world. Each kingdom has a really distinct character to them, and not just environmentally. The culture and the people and architectural design makes Final Fantasy XVI's world feel lived in, with merchants, refugees, and travelers moving from region to region identifiable by their attire. Of course, the environments are cool as well, but it takes an overworld approach where you travel from map area to map area, and to be honest, it's not all that compelling once you get past the cool scenery and foliage. And while the game's story takes place over 2 main time jumps, not a lot really changes within them, which is a bit disappointing and started pulling me out of the living, breathing world a bit. Traversal is also not bad, but if you're on a hunt, for example, or God forbid you pick up a side quest, we'll get into that in a little bit, there's no dedicated sprint button because you, that's why. And then getting a chocobo to traverse faster is totally missable because it's tossed behind a side quest, which, you know, you may be enticed to skip. Overall, it's a cool world, and I'm not really upset that it's not a proper open world. The gameplay and mechanics is where I start having real issues with this game because I want to love it, and there are some really cool jaw-dropping moments paired with little things this game does that really improves the experience, but then balances those moments with really tedious and shallow mechanics. Look, there's a reason why this game has no shortage of Devil May Cry memes and references. It basically plays exactly like one. Up to you if that's a good thing or not. I don't think it's bad, but here's what I mean by the conflicting balance. In the early game and most of the first half, the combat is very button mashy, even in combat focus mode without any of the combat rings equipped to help you dodge and perform the auto combos and heals. Then in the second half of the game, and we're talking like 20-hour halves here, half of which are straight up cutscenes, you have all these icons and abilities unlocked which makes combo chaining those very cool. The screen just starts vomiting colors and particle effects at you, and at this point the game says, cool, now do that for 5 minutes at a time because enemies just became these massive sponges. To me it just felt like a cheap way to elongate combat, and when you couple that with no other real strategic aspects from previous Final Fantasy games or just general JRPGs like elemental weaknesses or status effects, the moment-to-moment combat just got repetitive. I think Ryota Suzuki, who was the gameplay designer at Capcom for the Devil May Cry series, realized this, and to compensate just threw in the stagger meter to at least allow you to throw all your abilities at tankier enemies and mini-bosses, but at this point the extent of enemy variety comes in the form of just the visual design. Once you find a combo chain that works for you, you effectively effectively just repeat that all the way through. You can technically expand your abilities to some extent via ability points that you get rewarded after each battle, but outside of a few additional button inputs, upgrades just add damage or follow-up attacks to each ability. And on the gear side, it's basically just head over to the blacksmith and make the attack number go up. And then Final Fantasy XVI hits you with these really cool boss fights and icon fights. Like, technically they aren't that different mechanically, but the scale and magnitude of these on your screen is nothing short of awe-inspiring. It's like they took the summon sequences for these same icons from previous Final Fantasy games and said, what if you were in control for some of that, but also make it bigger? The game kept one-upping itself each time, and it almost felt ridiculous because I'd finish one or the second one and think to myself, it can't get any more grand than that, right? And then the game laughs at you and cranks it up again. Reaching these moments were a big driving force for me, and they played out cool enough that it made some of the tedious work to get there much more worth it. I mean, at one point suddenly this game turns into a Sonic platformer and I was just laughing and smiling through that entire sequence. It was a great experience, but man, did they make you work for those moments. I also want to quickly touch on the music in this game because Final Fantasy as a whole usually is standout in its music composition, and of course Final Fantasy XVI here is no different, but what I really want to appreciate is the general variety and the scale that you get in these songs. You're hit with the classic orchestral big string sections with drums, but Masayoshi Soken isn't afraid to throw in some synths in here, some guitar work in here, and it all complements what's happening on the screen, and I really appreciate that, so I wanted to make sure that I touched on that. I promise I'd loop back to the side quests, and honestly some people are a bit lukewarm on them. I think they're straight up bad. Poorly designed, and while it offers some entertaining dialogue here and there, a lot of them just boil down to fetch quests. Oi Clive, get back to that crappy little village to fight these enemies you've already encountered because we need the items that they drop, but they only drop when you have the side quest triggered, and repeat. The problem here is that because of that you are enticed to start skipping them, but the game decides to lock certain key gameplay improvements behind them, so it's possible that you complete the game without expanded potion slots or a chocobo. Eventually it just boiled down to me looking for the plus screen markers and skipping all the dialogue. To be fair, there are a handful of gems during the final leg of this game, but at that point you're 35 to 40 hours in, and it just feels like a missed opportunity to make the earlier side quests more compelling. Lastly, let's get into the story here because the story and voice acting and characters is a lot of the heart of all Final Fantasy games and where the majority of my internal conflict occurs with this game. Massive spoiler warnings because I gotta talk about the major beats of this game to really explain my position. The demo for Final Fantasy XVI took the internet by storm, it felt, and I was definitely caught in it. Final Fantasy games aren't strangers to more mature themes and gritty plots, but even then a lot of the promotion for this game was centered around how much of a dark fantasy approach this installment was taking, and when the demo came out it certainly felt that way, almost Game of Thrones in many regards. Maybe a little on the nose with the totally not a dire wolf, a mean mother political intrigue, except everyone gets a dragon in the form of icons. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a lot of cutscenes, literally half the game, and it kicks off with like an hour of political intrigue and exposition that really creates an interesting world setting, and then it adds the personal connection via brotherhood in Clive and Joshua. So when they get betrayed at Phoenix Gate, you get these subsequent moments of brutal consequence. Joshua and Clive's father gets offed in front of Joshua, there's blood and gore everywhere. Joshua transforming into the Phoenix in the subsequent firestorm means that there's real collateral damage as some of his own soldiers on his side are caught in that fire and burnt to a crisp. Clive, noticing this as his sworn protector, tries to go help him, and you're hit with this sequence where suddenly Ifrit appears and you don't know where Clive is. This incredible icon battle ensues with Ifrits and Phoenix really going after it. It's a really cool action sequence. By the end of the demo, Joshua in the form of the Phoenix has lost, and suddenly the game poses the question, was it Clive the one that transformed and inadvertently killed his own brother? That's some dark shit and got me hooked, and then you realize that this is a Final Fantasy game and Joshua being a Phoenix means that more likely he's coming back. You fast forward something like 13 years, Clive has been sold off into war slavery, he doesn't really know what happened to his brother, and then pretty quickly afterwards the game introduces this hooded character which you figure out almost immediately that it's Joshua, but for some reason hasn't revealed himself to Clive. Clive is chasing after revenge for his brother and his kingdom. As you progress, the story keeps doubling down on these political expositions and stories with other characters from the other realms. You're introduced to Cid, whose own motivations are pretty compelling in the form of trying to free the Branded, like Clive, by destroying the mother crystals that are also causing the Blight, this thing that is destroying the land. What's interesting about this is that Branded and Dominants, though ones who can summon icons like Joshua and Clive, are the primary magic users of the world, but they're treated like subhumans. It's an interesting way of approaching power dynamics, plus you get the added layer that the mother crystals and their magic is how the kingdoms are leveraging their power. So you have Clive's revenge motivation for his brother and this higher level political and world intrigue for the first half. Finally, you run into Joshua in the process of destroying the crystal. Clive figures out that it was him that nearly killed his brother and has to reckon with that, and then the game swings right back into typical anime JRPG story tropes with, wait, there's this other being called Ultima whom is actually the real threat and pulling the strings. This isn't necessarily a bad story mechanism. Final Fantasy Tactics, for example, interweaves a similar concept into sprawling political story. The problem is, Final Fantasy XVI effectively tosses all the world building and political exposition aside in the second half, as its looming threat is really in control. Destroying the rest of the Mother Crystals has pretty much the same exact pattern of go to this area, meet this person that knew Cid, and we'll help you, but first you gotta do some fetch quests for them too, and it really just kills the pacing. In the final leg, it poses some intriguing concepts of the creator and the created, some real gotta kill god stuff that, again, reverts to JRPG tropes we've seen before. It's a bit frustrating because there is a compelling story between Joshua and Clive, the whole idea of fighting back against fate and making your own path, even as it ends with Joshua sacrificing himself to allow Clive to take on Ultima, ultimately coming out triumphantly. Joshua's Phoenix power does subvert expectation because it wasn't the Phoenix's power that kept him alive from the events of the demo and the story opening. He just happened to survive and some hidden organization saved him, but there's no real reason for him to have avoided Clive this whole time, as the story hits you over the head that it's okay to accept help and not have to wait all on your own. Look, the vocal performances and the character work is relatively well done, and I'm not saying this was handled poorly or it's all bad, but like I mentioned earlier, this game sets up this Game of Thrones-esque setting with the demo and the opening of the game in the first half, and it tosses it aside to revert back to comfortable tropes that the franchise has done in the past. So what happens is neither of these approaches are fully fleshed out, and it feels rushed towards the end. If the story wanted to take this dark fantasy Game of Thrones-esque approach, commit to it, go all the way through instead of falling back to the safety net, which maybe happened because the ending of Game of Thrones wasn't handled well on TV, but it just made for a frustrating experience for me who isn't like a hardcore JRPG player. All in all, the highs of this game are handled well enough for me to have overall enjoyed this experience. There is still some real emotion to the story, even if it's a little bit cliche, but it is certainly a roller coaster of a ride. The highs are very high and the lows can get pretty low. In a year where you have a game like Tears of the Kingdom that is setting the bar for its genre, I don't think Final Fantasy XVI is setting a bar for story-based JRPG games. So while many people are going to enjoy the story, they like sitting for 20 hours at a time and just consuming characters and exposition, this game was afraid to commit all the way to a path, keeping one foot in Game of Thrones realm and one foot in classic anime JRPG tropes. And as a result, falls short of greatness. There are some interesting concepts here, some really cool story mechanics like the active time lore. The scale of Final Fantasy XVI makes it worthy of Game of the Year candidacy, but not for the actual win. Final Fantasy XVI gets a 4 out of 5. That's just my take on the game. A lot of people are already saying that this is one of their favorite Final Fantasies ever, and that's totally okay. I did really enjoy this game. I think it just falls short of really taking that next step. The pieces were all there, which is why I focus on why it doesn't reach that level for me. If you like this video and review, give a thumbs up, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.